Islamophobia is nothing new in American politics, but over the past few years with things like the Muslim ban that Donald Trump was pushing for, some really high profile attacks against Muslim members of Congress, it certainly seems more out there, more aggressive. So let's get into this topic of this community and how America and many of its elected politicians view it and communicate with us. And joining us now to break this down is Dr. Nazita Lajavardi, professor at Michigan State University and author of Outsiders at Home: The Politics of American Islamophobia. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Very glad to have you here. So first of all, if we could start with the book, tell our audience a little bit about what you set out to accomplish in writing this book.
Sure, yeah. So American Muslims are a group that we know very little about. This is a really hard group to measure for a number of reasons. So the census doesn't collect data on religion. A lot of people who stem from the Middle East, for instance, have to identify as white on the census. So we actually know very little about American Muslims and who they really are in American politics. So this book tries really hard to come up with a number of different ways to measure the Muslim sociopolitical experiences, particularly in a post 9/11 world. Because American Muslims weren't really surveyed prior to 9/11, because there are very few public opinion polls from the general public prior to 9/11 about Islam, Muslims, or even Muslim Americans. We don't actually know what the public even thought about them, you know? And so this book tries really hard to use the news media primarily as a lens to build a constructive sort of timeline of how Muslims have been discussed over time. So the book tries to do a number of different things, but really to assess the political discrimination of Muslim Americans.
And that makes a lot of sense because there's not that much information out there, at least historically. We sort of have a gut idea of what many Americans, sort of how they view the community. I know in the past, looking at like warmth meters for different groups in American society, Muslims are down near the bottom. I don't know if they're lower than atheists, but those are basically the two groups that Americans are very confident that they don't like. And what's interesting is you wrote a paper, How Negative Sentiment Towards Muslim Americans Predicts Support for Trump in the 2016 Presidential Election. And so this overall animus towards the community, it has some implications.
Oh, this is probably the most overlooked part of support for Trump right now. Muslim American resentment, which is basically 9 stereotype items that I've worked with a number of colleagues, but also generated, talk a lot about in the book. These attitudinal measures towards Muslim Americans, specific attitudinal measures towards Muslim Americans, they are important for predicting Trump support. You know, after party ID, it becomes Muslim American resentment. We think usually that it's racial resentment. These are traditional 4 items that political scientists and other scholars use to measure resentment, but it's actually not, right? It's Muslim American resentment that's more powerful in predicting support. And it's not just for Trump, right? It's also for a number of other policy arenas. So we cannot ignore it, particularly because it played such an impactful role in the 2016 election.
Doctor, I hear what you're saying and you have a lot of data to support it, but I read that it was actually just economic anxiety. So you should look into that. That apparently is all of what you're saying is nonsense and fake science. But anyway, so to just briefly turn to a more positive part of this, you had another paper, and this had to do with public opinion around the Muslim ban, and that actually had a more positive sort of outcome.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because we think that Muslim American resentment hit an all-time high after, with the 2016 campaign, and then even afterwards with the Muslim ban, right? We saw 3 iterations of a Muslim ban. It was upheld by the Supreme Court. This is something that we might think is mostly supported, right? That resentment is pervasive across the American electorate. Well, we found no. Actually, a couple colleagues and I, Castro Schooley and Lauren Collingwood, we've done a couple of studies examining how the protests around the Muslim ban may have shifted individual level public opinion. And this work, I think, is really important because it shows that the information environment was really motivated around issues of American identity, right? Around the founding fathers and religious freedom, sort of really going back to the history of the United States. And what we find is that when people are strong and high on American identity, it really doesn't matter about your partisanship. You actually reduced support for the Muslim ban. And that reduction of support was actually something that stayed for up to a year later. So we see long-term public opinion shift, which has traditionally been very difficult to pinpoint, but on this issue with the Muslim ban, really around American identity. And we see that even right now being raised again with the impeachment. You see individuals in Congress bringing up this was, impeachment is a tool of the founding fathers. It's incredibly important. We need to go back to those times. So, American identity is very strong. We shouldn't undercut it.
So what you had said earlier about the anti-Muslim animus driving support for Trump more than traditional racial resentment towards other groups, I had not known about that. That is very interesting. I am assuming, though, that the apparently quite savvy and data-driven Trump election team in 2016, they probably came across that information at some point. And I wonder, I know that you're talking about large communities over multiple years. It's harder to talk about specific cases, but recently, new representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have been elevated as constant targets of attack by Donald Trump and by surrogates in Republican media. Does that potentially explain why these representatives, who don't wield a ton of individual political power, are being put on the same level as a Nancy Pelosi or a Chuck Schumer on the national stage?
Yeah, look, far be it from me to dismiss Islamophobia as a root cause of why we see overwhelming attention on women of color, especially Muslim women of color. It's hard for me to know exactly what's driving the disproportionate attention on these women, but it's not lost, I think, on many of us in academia and as well as stakeholders and policymakers that there is a disproportionate amount of attention on these two women. Where is the attention on Andre Carson, right? Where was the similar attention on Keith Ellis and two other Muslim members of Congress, right? That intersectional space that women of color, Muslim women occupy, I think cannot be ignored, And it's not something that I've actually looked into. I know a couple colleagues are beginning to look into this, but very little data exists. And I think it's important for us to be mindful that these sorts of biases, sexism, Islamophobia might be driving.
They might have a stronger effect than the sum of their parts. And that's a great point about Keith Ellison, by the way. I hadn't thought of that. Dr. Nazida Lajavardi, thank you so much for joining us. I would love to talk to you once we're a little bit farther into the campaign to see if perhaps my little prediction there might play out some more.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you. For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.